Designing and implementing Microsoft Azure Networking Solutions AZ-700 updated dumps are the latest version in the whole market, which can help you test all the related topics. Share some updated Microsoft AZ-700 exam dumps here. 1. You fail to establish a site-to-site VPN connection between your company's main office and an Azure virtual network. You need to troubleshoot what prevents you from establishing the IPsec tunnel. Which diagnostic log should you review? A. IKE diagnostic log, B. Gateway diagnostic log, C. Tunnel diagnostic log, D. Root diagnostic log. 2. You have an Azure virtual network that contains a subnet named Subnet 1. Subnet 1 is associated to a network security group, NSG, named NSG1. NSG1 blocks all outbound traffic that is not allowed explicitly. Subnet 1 contains virtual machines that must communicate with the Azure Cosmos DB service. You need to create an outbound security rule in NSG1 to enable the virtual machines to connect to Azure Cosmos DB. What should you include in the solution? A. A service tag, B. A private endpoint, C. A subnet delegation, D. An application security group. 3. You have an Azure subscription that contains a virtual network name VNet1. VNet1 contains a virtual machine named VM1 and an Azure firewall named FW1. You have an Azure firewall policy named FP1 that is associated to FW1. You need to ensure that RDP requests to the public IP address of FW1 route to VM1. What should you configure on FP1? A. An application rule, B. A network rule, C. URL filtering, D. A DNAT rule. 4. You have an Azure subscription that contains a user named admin1 and a resource group named RG1. RG1 contains an Azure Network Watcher instance named NW1. You need to ensure that admin1 can place a lock on NW1. The solution must use the principle of least privilege. Which role should you assign to admin1? A. User access administrator, B. Network contributor, C. Resource policy contributor, D. Monitoring contributor. 5. You have an Azure Virtual Desktop deployment that has 500 session hosts. All outbound traffic to the Internet uses a NAT gateway. During peak business hours, some users report that they cannot access Internet resources. In Azure Monitor, you discover many failed SNAT connections. You need to increase the available SNAT connections. What should you do? A. Add a public IP address. B. Bind the NAT gateway to another subnet. C. Deploy Azure Standard Load Balancer that has outbound rules. 6. You have an Azure Front Door instance named FD1 that is protected by using Azure Web Application Firewall (WAF). FD1 uses a front-end host named app1.contoso.com to provide access to Azure Web Apps hosted in the East US Azure region and the West US Azure region. You need to configure FD1 to block requests to app1.contoso.com from all countries other than the United States. What should you include in the WAF policy? A. A front-end host association, B. A managed rule set, C. A custom rule that uses a rate limit rule, D. A custom rule that uses a match rule. 7. You have 10 Azure App Service instances. Each instance hosts the same web app. Each instance is in a different Azure region. You need to configure Azure Traffic Manager to direct users to the instance that has the lowest latency. Which routing method should you use? A. Geographic, B. Weighted, C. Performance, D. Priority. 8. You have an Azure virtual network named VNet1 that has one subnet. VNet1 is in the West Europe Azure region. You deploy an Azure App Service app named App1 to the West Europe region. You need to provide App1 with access to the resources in VNet1. The solution must minimize costs. What should you do first? A. Create a private link. B. Create a new subnet. C. Create a NAT gateway. D. Create a gateway subnet and deploy a virtual network gateway. 9. You plan to deploy an Azure virtual network. You need to design the subnets. Which 3 types of resources require a dedicated subnet? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. Note: each correct selection is worth 1 point. A. VPN gateway. B. Azure Bastion. C. Azure Active Directory Domain Services. Azure ADDS. D. Azure Application Gateway v2. E. Azure Private Link. 10. What should you implement to meet the virtual network requirements for the virtual machines that connect to VNet 4 and VNet 5? A. A private endpoint. B. A virtual network peering. C. A private link service. D. A routing table. E. A service endpoint.